We're going to teach this morning on the benefits of speaking in tongues. God does nothing for nothing. He invented tongues. It wasn't some old Pentecostal preacher who invented it. It was God. In His wisdom, He decided that tongues was valuable. And I thought we'd just take some time to explore the benefits, the purpose of tongues. In 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 6, Paul says, "Now, brethren, if I come to you speaking in tongues, what shall it profit you?" And so there has to be a profit, there has to be a margin, there has to be a benefit. Everything God does is for a benefit. And so we have to look for these benefits. In 1 Corinthians 12:7 says, "The manifestation of the Spirit is given to each one for the profit of all." So the best way to tap into grace isn't just to get grace for yourself, it's to get grace to give away. And there has to be a profit. It's for the profit of all, for the benefit of all. And if we keep our eyes on the benefit, so often we focus on the mechanics of it or the divisive issues concerning tongues. Go for the benefits. Put your focus, put your emphasis on the benefits. That's where the life is, that's where the revelation is. And so you need to focus on the benefits. One of the confusions that keeps us from focusing on the benefits, one of the confusions that happens is, the thing that's confusing is people don't realize that there are different kinds of tongues. They think of it as one-dimensional. For example, in Acts 2:4, it says that they spoke in other tongues, and people on the street, thousands of people on the street, understood what they're saying. And a lot of people take that one instance, and they impose it upon every instance and says, that's what happens, and that's what always happens, and that nothing less than that will happen, and that's what they're expecting. Well, that only happened one time. And so when they spoke in tongues at Cornelius' house, for example, no one had an understanding of what they were saying. No one had an interpretation of it. That sign where unbelievers understood what they're saying didn't happen. When Paul ministered to the Ephesians and they all spoke in tongues, God didn't open up anyone's understanding as to what they're saying, and there's no interpretation of it. And so anytime we take one thing and we impose it on everything, we're going to misunderstand what God's purposes are. And so the translators of the King James Bible understood that there are different kinds of tongues. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 10, he's talking about working of miracles and prophecy and the different gifts that God gives people, discerning of spirits. And it says, to another, divers kinds of tongues, different kinds of tongues. He's not speaking about different kinds of languages. That's redundant. That's beside the point. And then it says to another, interpretation of tongues. Look down in verse 28, same chapter 12, verse 28. And God has appointed these to the church, first apostles, second prophets, third teachers, after that miracles and gifts of healing, helps, administrations, and diversities of tongues. There are different kinds of tongues, different operations, different ways that it's manifested. So I thought we'd explore those for a few minutes today so we can go deeper in our understanding of the benefits of each kind of tongue. So on the day of Pentecost, if you want to look at it, it's Acts chapter 2, verse 4. It says, they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak with other tongues. And that's literally other languages. And so people on the street, we know there are more than 3,000 because 3,000 came to Christ that day. So there's thousands of people on the street who understood what the 120 people, there's 120 people in the upper room all speaking in tongues at the same time. The scripture says that they were all doing it. That includes Mary, the mother of Jesus, some of Jesus' own brothers, the 12 disciples, plus other people. They're all Their heads are on fire. They're speaking in tongues. It's spilled out on the street, and it lists the number of nationalities that were there because it was a major festival, major feast day. People came from all over the world, and it lists, I forget the number, I don't see it right here in front of me, but I think there are 18 different nationalities represented that are listed there, 16 or 18, and they all understood what they were saying because they were speaking literally in other languages that they had never learned. It was a real miracle. I've never had that experience. I've never had that kind of tongue. I've thought about it different times. I've been in an elevator with a bunch of Chinese men, and I'm thinking, I wonder what would happen if I just started speaking in tongues. I've wanted to try. I just haven't done it. I mean, I haven't been impacted that way. And so I've not had this experience, but I know of people who have, and I have friends who've had this kind of experience. I remember reading about a guy named Harold Bradenson. He had just begun speaking in tongues himself, and he actually was in Washington, D.C., walked up to this exotic-looking, foreign-looking woman. He didn't know her at all. She just looked different. And he walked up to her and began speaking in tongues, and she was astonished. She was shocked. She said, "Why are you telling me these things?" He said, "What am I saying?" She said, "Don't you know?" He said, "No, I don't know what I'm saying." She said, "How is that possible?" She said, "I'm Egyptian." She was an ambassador's daughter, I think. And she says, "I study classical Egyptian, not just modern Egyptian. I study classical, ancient Egyptian." She said, "You're speaking it perfectly." He said, "What am I saying?" She said, "You don't know what you're saying?" He says, "No." She says, "You're telling me about the things of God." Pointing her to God. And so it's a real experience. It's not something I've had, but it's a real experience. It's a kind, there are diversities of tongues. It's a kind of tongue. That can happen today. But watch this. The writers of the King James Bible, for some reason, decided that they'd put in italics, which means they're adding the word. It's not in the original Greek. It's not in the original language. But they put in the word unknown tongue. Let's look at this. Go to 1 Corinthians 14:2. And there's at least 3 instances where the translators decided this is not other tongues. This can't be other tongues. It has to be something different. We don't know what it is, but they decided to call it unknown tongues. Now look, if you have a King James Bible, it'll say in italics. I don't know what all translations you have, but it's a major distinction. Let's look at verse 2. It says, "For he who speaks in an unknown tongue does not speak to men." Now that's different than Acts 2:4, where they were clearly speaking to men. "He that speaks in an unknown tongue does not speak to men, but to God, for no one understands him." So it's clearly not that kind of tongue. There are different kinds, but it's not the kind of tongue that men understand. However, in the Spirit realm, he's speaking mysteries. So if you look around this room, this is a physical realm. Well, within this realm is another realm that we can't see. If you could see, if your eyes were open, you would see angels standing in this room. You'd see angels walking past. You might even see demonic spirits or angels on the outside looking in. You might see heavenly traffic. And that's the realm where God works, and he commands angels to go. Satan has to come on a very short leash and give an account to God every day. You would see that realm. And he says that he that speaks in an unknown tongue affects that realm, the spirit realm. Let's look at another one. Look at verse 4, just a couple verses down. 1 Corinthians 14:4. "He that speaks in an unknown tongue edifies himself, but he who prophesies edifies the church. Well, that's different. See, in Acts 2:4, when they spoke in other tongues, that benefited the hearer. They understood the marvelous works of God. They heard the gospel. It helped them open their heart to the gospel. Maybe that's more accurate to say. But here it says, this is for your personal edification. Unknown tongues isn't for public use, it's for private use. It's for personal edification. Now look at verse 14, same chapter, 1 Corinthians 14:14. For if I pray in an unknown tongue, my spirit prays, but my understanding is unfruitful. What's profound about this verse is he's taken it out of the public and used it in a personal way where it's a prayer language. Now that's what I have. I've never spoken in tongues in public and someone else has interpreted it. I don't have that kind of tongue. That's what I call the gift of tongues. I don't have that. What I have is a prayer language that anybody can have. Anybody can have this language. It's a prayer language. It says, if I pray in an unknown tongue. So it's for personal edification. It's for prayer. It's not for the benefit of men. It's not that men will hear me. It's so that God will hear me. Back to verse 2 again. So unknown tongue is a kind of tongue. Another kind of tongue is when you speak in tongues and someone else interprets it in a public meeting. I don't have that kind of tongue. In fact, I don't even know, really, now that I think about it, I don't know anyone in our church who has that kind of tongue. Yet, almost everybody in our church speaks in tongues. It's just not that kind. We don't have that, or it's not something that someone's pressing in for at this time. I wish they would. But on the other hand, most of our gatherings are filled with believers, not so much unbelievers, because we're more of a teaching church than we are an evangelistic church. But if we got out in a place where we're working with unbelievers, that gift where you'd speak in tongues and someone else would interpret would become very useful, much more powerful. When I was a new believer, it happened a lot. We heard it almost every meeting we gathered in. It was electric. It would stop the meeting. I mean, it was really something. It really caused people to recognize that God was truly doing something in our midst. We don't hear it much these days. I'm not sure why. But it's a kind of tongue. So right away we see that there's different kinds of tongues. Each one has a distinct and separate purpose. When we treat it all as one thing and don't look at the purpose, we become confused. We'll end up, we'll not press in for anything because we're not focused on anything. So tongues has a purpose. God designed it. God invented it. And so today we need to explore some of the purposes so that it'll incite a desire for you to speak in tongues. Otherwise, you won't shoot for it. You won't press in for it because you don't know what it's for. Amen?